Good morning. Welcome you back to our Sunday morning Bible class. We're going to continue our study today on our Christian evidences. What we're doing is we're using the Bible correspondence course developed by Apologetics Press. We talked last week about some faces of unbelievers. We talked about those like atheists who don't believe in God. We talked about agnostics who, basically believe you can't obtain that knowledge about God, so why even try? We talked about the skeptics who feel like you have to use the five senses to be able to prove that God exists, and so they are skeptical or they doubt that there is a God. And then we also talked about how there's an infidel person that not only does not believe in God or the Bible, they don't want anybody else to either. So we talked about those people, and then we talked about some reasons for unbelief. And when we went through each one of those, explaining some reasons as to why. So what we want to do is we want to continue that thought and to kind of when we go out into the world and we talk to people, we need to know where to start. We need to know how to talk to them, because like we talked about last time, is if you've got an atheist who doesn't believe in God and you try to prove God to him through the Bible, that's not going to do any good, because at that point in time, he does not believe that the Bible is true and is inspired. So we want to be able to start, before then. So this is what we're going to start doing for lesson number 2. Is we're going to start looking at the existence of God. So we're going to start our lesson 2 here, and we're going to talk about this cause and effect. And this is going to get pretty technical here, but I think we'll do just fine here with no problems whatsoever. But just follow along with me, and I think we'll make it through it here. So let's talk about this. All right. So one of the most basic issues that any human mind can consider is the question: does God exist? There seems to be a lot of that in the world today. Is God is dead, or does God exist, or is God here with us, and all this stuff. This is a natural question for anyone to ask. And the only way to answer this question is to seek out and examine the evidence. We want to find out, is this truthful or not? So that's the whole reason for this, is we're looking at some Christian evidences, or some evidence to say, yes, there is a God. And the problem here is scientists would have you believe that the only way to search and find for evidence is to prove it scientifically, or in their method is use the five senses or use empirical data. But what they don't understand, and others as well, is this is not the only way of arriving at proof. So we're going to kind of look at some of that information today. But one thing you'll if you talk to any legal people, they recognize this validity called prima facie. And what it is it's saying this is when enough evidence is available to establish such a high probability of fact being true that unless a particular fact somehow can be refuted, it is considered proven beyond reasonable doubt. So let's kind of break down what we're trying to say there. We're basically saying is that when you have all this evidence, or you have enough evidence to say, what, God does exist, then unless some evidence is presented to you that refutes it, that goes against it, then it's considered proven beyond reasonable doubt. So we're saying, hey, here's the information, here's the evidence, it's got to be true unless you can tell me otherwise. So we're going to look at this evidence to make the same case for the existence of God. So we're going to talk about this first thing called cause and effect. So before we do that, what we're going to do is we have to admit something here. We have to admit that the universe exists and it is real. Okay? And I think any rational person, it doesn't matter whether they're atheists, agnostics, skeptics, you name it, anybody would have to admit that the universe exists and is real. And I know that sounds silly, but we have to establish that. So there's no way to dispute that. The universe exists and is real. So with saying that, the natural question arises, how did the universe get here? Where did it come from? Okay? So before we get into that, let's talk about this law of cause and effect, okay? But before we get into that, let's talk about this word law. And here's the reason why I bring this up, because if you remember from your science class, you have things called theory and you have things called law. And the difference between the two is a theory is a guess. I believe that this is going to happen, so I need to test it. But then you've got these things that are called laws, or, kind of like laws of nature, things that, are to be true, that are factual, that they've all agreed upon. They've been able to prove it multiple times. It is a law. So when we talk about some of these laws, we need to keep that in mind, that these are factual. These are things that are, basically not up for discussion because they have been proven more than once. Okay? So this is where this law of cause and effect comes into place. And what it states is that every material effect must have an adequate cause. And the key word to this is an adequate cause. Adequate being the key word here. So what we're trying to say here is, when we use the example here, is this big, massive river, miles wide, it turned muddy because a little frog jumped in. Now, obviously, you're saying, well, that's just silly. A little tiny frog cannot cause the entire river to get muddy. And so what we're saying here is you've got an effect, but you don't have an adequate cause. Okay? So, and another example here is the book did not fall from the table because the fly landed on it. The fly does not weigh enough to knock a book off into the floor. So what we're trying to say here is when we see this effect, we have to have an adequate cause. It has to make sense as far as the cause is concerned. So what we have to say is rephrase our original question and say, what caused the universe? And so with this, you have three possible answers. So the first answer, you could say, well, you know what? The universe is eternal. It's always been here and always will be. Okay? Or your second one could be is, well, the universe is not eternal. Rather, it created itself out of nothing. Okay? And then the last one is the universe is not eternal. It did not create itself out of nothing, but instead was created by something outside of it and superior to itself. And we'll talk more about that here in a minute. So let's look at each one of these answers to see which one might be an adequate cause. All right? So the first one here is the universe eternal? So the most comfortable position for a person who does not believe in God is the idea that the universe has always been here and always will be. And there's a reason why. Because such an idea avoids not only the problem of a beginning and an ending, but the need for a first cause. Because if it has always been here and always will be, there is no cause to even discuss. So thus they can disprove God. However, modern science recognizes that the universe is not eternal. It had a beginning and it will have an end. And this is where we need to put our thinking caps on from science class back in high school and talk about some laws that science provides to us that totally disproves the idea that the universe is eternal. And the first one is the first law of thermodynamics states this. It says that neither matter nor energy can be created or destroyed in nature. And what we're trying to say here is you can't take energy and completely wipe it out. Now, we do know from our own experiences that energy can be changed form. For example, you've got when you burn wood, it changes in the form of heat and ash. So it changes form. When you look at an ice cube, it goes from a solid to a liquid. It could evaporate and become a gas. And then, we're just thinking about how the rain cycle works. This energy is not being created nor destroyed. It's just it can change form. But then you're looking at this other side of this coin, is that if it can't be created or destroyed, then you need to look at the second law of thermodynamics, which states that everything is running down and wearing out. And what we're trying to say here is that energy is becoming less and less available for use. Let's give an example of this. How about gas? Whether it's gasoline or oil or natural gas, these things are being used and consumed to where we have a finite amount of resources available. So what we're saying here is, time is wearing out. Energy is wearing out. The earth is wearing out. So what we learn from this is if we take these two, again, laws of thermodynamics, we see something here. First of all, it tells us that there was a beginning. And in the beginning, for the first time ever, the universe was in a state where all energy was available. That nothing has been used, that you had your max amount of capability. Okay? But then it also tells us, number two, that there is an end in the future where no more energy is available, thus causing the universe to die. In other words, everything is wearing out. And the best way to explain this to you is the universe is like a wound up watch. It's running down. Now, I know this is freaking out some of the younger folks, so let me put it into some modern day vernacular. If you've got a cell phone or an Apple Watch, you know how you kind of charge it up? That's when you're at your beginning max energy, right? And then eventually it's going to run out to 0%. So imagine this. Imagine the universe is a battery. It's got a battery. It's wearing down to as close to 0% as possible. It is going to die. That's what we're saying here with the first and second law of thermodynamics. So if we're saying that we have these laws, we have identified these laws, we know that it has not always been here, and it is not always going to be here. So the answer is the universe is eternal is not correct. That is not a possible answer. So let's look at the second answer here. It says, was the universe created out of nothing? Now, I know this is a big popular thing that everybody seems to latch on to, but what we're talking about here is kind of like the Big Bang Theory. There was just something going on here, maybe nothing, and then boom, everything happened. And over billions and billions and billions of years, that this entire universe was created, including the earth, and including everything that's on it, with every complex organism that is on this earth, was just created from nothing. But what you find out is in the past, it would be practically impossible to find any reputable science that would suggest that the universe was created out of nothing. This is something that has, kind of taken hold over the last few years. And you got to ask yourself why. Why has this become such a big thing? Because the thought would suggest that the basic law of physics, these laws that everybody has agreed to say, hey, we can prove it time after time and again, it would prove that these would be untrue. But now, you do have to recognize here that matter and energy can be converted. We talked about that, but we all know it is common fact that we only have a finite amount of natural resources. All this matter and energy is going away. So when you look at scientists and things like this and how they identify things, it's based upon observation, reproducibility, and then that empirical data. Now keep in mind that empirical data is that using your five senses. So they say, hey, this Big Bang happened, and this is the only evidence, and what they're doing is they're saying, hey, it can be observed, reproducibility, empirical data. But when you say, okay, that's great, thanks. You told us about the Big Bang Theory. Now give me some empirical data to back that up. What do? They can't, because when they're pressed for this empirical data that documents the claim that the universe created itself out of nothing, they can't do it because there is no such evidence to suggest it, which is why it's called the Big Bang Theory, is because it's a guess and they have absolutely no proof whatsoever. So this idea is absurd to think that the universe was created out of nothing. It is both philosophically and scientifically, you can't make this answer work. So it is really something that is very recent, that is kind of just off the wall crazy with no evidence whatsoever. So that leaves us with one final answer, and let's see what it says here. So basically, we're saying, well, then the universe was created. So we know that either the universe had a beginning or it did not. But all evidence that we've looked at without looking at anything else tells us it did. It did have a beginning. It did have an end. Because if the universe had a beginning, it either has a cause or it did not. So this is where this law of cause and effect comes into play. So it is correct to acknowledge that the universe had a cause because the universe is an effect. In other words, the effect here is the universe. So what we have to find out here is what is the adequate cause? What caused the universe? So since it is obvious that the universe is not eternal, and since it is also obvious that the universe could not have created it out of something, the only remaining alternative is that the universe was created by something or someone. And if you kind of back up to what our original answer was, is it's not only that it's something or someone, but it has to be someone that is outside the universe and superior to it, because that's where your adequate cause comes into play. So what we're saying here is basically there's something that is more powerful, that lives outside the realm of the universe, that created it. That's what makes sense. That's what makes sense in all of this. Okay? So what we'd say here is this: is the law of cause and effect and the cosmological argument for the existence of God based upon that law have implications in every area of human life. In other words, we look at this. Law of cause and effect is more than just this argument or anything else. It affects everything, but we're using it because it makes the most sense. Let me give you an example of this. The scientists say that out of nothing, or even out of something, it doesn't matter to me, came this big bang, and complex human, animal, whatever, has started the universe, and we are just lucky to have everything set in place. I mean, just everything fell in place the way it should be. As far as the way the earth rotates around the sun, the way the earth, goes in an elliptical orbit, how the human body operates. They're saying that we're all just lucky. Well, compare this to Stonehenge. I think most everybody knows about Stonehenge, about how the rocks were set up in a certain formation, and there's different, levels of some kind of prehistoric type of ages and things like that. But compare this to Stonehenge, to this origin of the universe and life itself. No person in their right mind would say, walk up there to Stonehenge and be like, you know what? I'm pretty sure that Stonehenge just happened by accident. That I think, just kind of water eroded around, and it moved these big rocks and set them up in a nice fancy circular area. Nobody would believe that just happened by accident. But if you look at when you talk to atheists or agnostics or even some of these skeptics, they expect us to believe that this highly ordered, well-designed universe just happened. And that's silly for them to think that. So with that being said, what lesson 3 brings us to is the continuing this idea of the existence of God, and then talks about some of the design. And so what I would suggest to you guys is continue this study. Again, they are available on Apologetics Press website. I think they're listed under the home study course, and they're free for you to look at on their webpage, or like I said, you can order them from their stores. You can buy the pamphlets and everything associated with it, and continue their study, because this lesson number 3 is just fantastic in explaining it. I'll give you a idea of some of the things that it talks about. I believe it says that the earth moves 1/8 of an inch every like 18 miles it travels. Okay, and basically what we're saying is around the sun. So we're saying it moves as in 1/8 of an inch around the sun. That if it ended up moving 1/9 of an inch, it would either freeze to death, or we would freeze to death or burn up because we're too close or too far away from the sun. So what we're saying here is that tiny amount, that shows that there is design. We talk about some of these other things that are in the universe about, how fast we're moving. If we were going too fast, that our seasons would go too fast, we could never grow anything. If we went too slow around the sun, that, our harvest would, we would be so dry and so hot that, we could never eat anything. So, basically everything is set in motion perfectly. And what we're saying is when there is a design, then that means there is a designer. And what we're saying here is, think about this. Imagine a cell phone here. It doesn't just, poof, and it's here. We can tell that it has been designed. It has been, someone's added some buttons for volume, a screen to look at it, speakers to hear things. It has been designed. So if there is a design, then there is a designer. It didn't poof out of nothing. So what we're saying here is they have to admit that if there is a design, then there is a designer. And this lesson lists tons of facts that you need to know. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a tool that you need to have in your toolbox. I appreciate you guys joining me today, and I encourage you to continue your study with this. This is good information for you to have when you're going out into the world, talking to other folks, trying to get them to become believers and get them to understand that the facts are out there, that the evidence is there, and they need to know it, that their soul is important, that God wants them. So guys, until next time, have a good day.
Well, good morning and welcome to our Bible class. We're going to continue our study this morning through the book Out with Doubt by Kyle Butt. And we're looking at part 2 of Is the Bible from God? If you remember from last week, we looked at some things about the Bible. We looked at the idea of inspiration, how God inspired the men who wrote the Bible to put down the words that they put. Some amazing facts, the fact that over a period of 1,600 years, that there were 40 different men from different cultures and times in history that wrote down the words of the Bible, and nothing contradicts itself. It's all coinciding with one another. And then some scientific facts and some medical facts that were practiced or known about in the scriptures that we look at today and see they're just as true today as they were back then. Well, today we're going to look at the idea of the prophecy that's in the scripture. So let's begin. Start off with a scripture, Jeremiah 28 and verse 9. When the word of the prophet comes to pass, the prophet will be known as one whom the Lord has truly sent. You have the remote control in your hand and a bag of potato chips resting securely between your leg and armrest. It's 9 p.m. and you're channel surfing, trying to find a decent show to watch. Even though your particular cable system can pick up 150 channels, you can't seem to find anything that appeals to you. But there's one thing that annoys you even more than the fact that you cannot locate anything to watch. About every third channel, some lady pops up on the screen advertising the psychic hotline. That's right. For only $1.95 a minute, you can call and have someone tell you things that they think are going to happen in the future regarding your career, your love life, your popularity, etc. As cheesy as the advertising is, and as absurd as it sounds, people spend thousands of dollars every month calling to find out what is going to happen in their future. Truth be told, being able to predict the future accurately would be quite valuable. Imagine knowing who would win every Super Bowl for the next 20 years. If that kind of information fell into the hands of someone who gambled, they easily could become a millionaire by placing bets on the right team. But we know that no one today can tell the future without being wrong most of the time. Sure, some people make a lucky guess every now and then, but sooner or later their predictions fall through. However, if someone could be 100% right 100% of the time, how important or more impressive would that be? The Bible provides the answer. When the word of the prophet comes to pass, the prophet will be known as one whom the Lord has truly sent. Jeremiah 28 and verse 9. If someone or something like a book could predict the future and be correct 100% of the time, then obviously that ability came directly from God. So the question arises, is there such a person or book? Let's take a closer look and see. The fall of Tyre. In Ezekiel chapter 26, verse 1 through 14, the Bible foretells with miraculous precision the destruction of the ancient city of Tyre. The prophet Ezekiel predicted that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, would destroy the city, verse 7 and 8. Many nations would come up against Tyre, verse 3. The city will be leveled and scraped clean like a bare rock, verse 4. And its stones, timbers, and solid would be cast into the sea, verse 12. The surrounding area would become spot for spreading out of fishermen's nets, verse 5. And last, the city would never be rebuilt to its former glory, verse 14. Again, that's Ezekiel chapter 26, verse 1 through 14. To the people who heard Ezekiel, such predictions would have seemed unusual. In many instances, whenever a city was destroyed by an invading army, it was rebuilt using the same materials, since such materials were costly and hard to get. Documented secular history records that each one of Ezekiel's predictions came true. And that's the amazing thing. Documented secular history records things. There's a lot of things that are recorded in history that you can see that happened to different nations, like happened here to Tyre. That if you look in our history books, you can see what happened to them. But then you go back to the Bible and you can see where it was predicted about. It says Tyre was a coastal city that had a somewhat unusual arrangement. In addition to the inland city, there also was an island about 3/4 of a mile offshore. Nebuchadnezzar besieged the mainland city in 586 BC. But when he finally was able to take the city in about 573, his victory was hollow. He did not realize that the inhabitants had abandoned the city and moved to the island, a situation that remains virtually unchanged for the next 241 years. Then, in 332 BC, Alexander the Great conquered the city, but not with ease. To get to the island, he literally had his army scrape clean the inland city of all the timbers, stones, and dirt. He had his soldiers dump those materials into the ocean, thereby constructing a land bridge to the island city, which he conquered fairly quickly. The prophet Ezekiel looked hundreds of years into the future and predicted that the original city of Tyre would never regain its position of wealth and power. Instead, it would be a bald rock where groups of fishermen would gather to spread their nets. And that is exactly what history records have as happening. How could Ezekiel have known, without God having told him ahead of time, that all these events would take place in history? And that's the thing that I think the author's trying to get across here, is that he only knew these things because God was the one that told him these things. All right, let's look at another one. Babylon the Great. Another strikingly accurate prophecy concerning the ancient city of Babylon can be found in the Bible. Babylon was one of the richest cities in the world during the year 740 BC to 680 BC. During those glory days, the city prospered like it had the Midas touch. Everything it touched seemed to turn into gold. It was located between the Tigris and Euphrates River, a strip of land so agriculturally productive that today it is known as the Fertile Crescent. But its agriculture and well-watered plants were not the reason it was famous. Babylon gained its reputation because of its high, massive walls and its strong defensive battlements. In fact, ancient writers describe walls that were 14 miles long on all four sides of the city and that reached heights of over 300 feet, taller than many buildings today. Not only were the walls long and high, but in some places they were 75 feet thick. The walls were not the only form of defense, however. The Euphrates River surrounded the city, providing a perfect moat that ranged anywhere from 65 to 250 feet across. This defense combination appeared to make the city unconquerable. Yet, in spite of its strong military and defensive strength, God's prophet foretold Babylon's destruction. In Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 9, the prophet declared that God would raise and cause to come up against Babylon an assembly of great nations from the northern country. This prediction probably seemed unfounded at the time it was made, because none of the countries in the north came close to having enough strength to defeat Babylon. But years after the prophecy, Cyrus, the king of the Medo-Persian Empire, mounted a huge force of many different nations and marched southward against Babylon. The details of the fulfillment of prophecy are nothing short of amazing. Jeremiah recorded that God had declared, "I will dry up her sea and make her springs dry." Jeremiah 51, verse 36. Again, the prophet foretold, "A drought is against her waters, and they will be dried up, for it is a land of carved images." Jeremiah 50, verse 38. Also, the prophet promised that the Lord has spoken, "I will prepare their feast, I will make them drunk, that they may rejoice and sleep a perpetual sleep and not wake." Jeremiah 51, 39. Now listen to how the story as history unfolds. The Euphrates River ran underneath the walls of Babylon. After a siege of 2 years, Cyrus finally was able to divert the river to make it flow into a huge marsh on the west side of the city. By doing this, he dried up the rivers of Babylon and provided an easy way for soldiers to enter the city under the walls where the water once flowed. But the Babylonians inside the city had no idea what was taking place. They could have defended the city, but instead they were feasting and getting drunk. Cyrus ordered his men to act like drunken revilers, and by the time the people of Babylon knew what had hit them, the city was filled with enemy troops who ultimately conquered it. Even though these circumstances would be enough to establish the accuracy of the prophecy of Jeremiah, and thus of the Bible itself, the prophet's predictions do not stop there. Chapter 50 and 51 of Jeremiah's books are filled with more futuristic condemnations of Babylon, each of which was fulfilled in small detail. Truly the words spoken by the prophet came to pass. So again, another prediction that took place, and then years later is whenever it happened. Now, one that we're probably all familiar with, or should be familiar with, the coming of Christ. In addition to its prophecies concerning people, places, and events, the Old Testament contains more than 300 messianic prophecies. A messianic prophecy is one that tells about the coming Messiah or Savior. These prophecies were written to tell the world about the one who would come to save mankind from sin. The prophecies concerning the Messiah said that he would be rejected and know grief, Isaiah 53, verse 3, and be betrayed by a friend, Psalm 41 and verse 9, for 30 pieces of silver, Zechariah 11 and verse 12. In fact, he was rejected and betrayed, John 13, verse 18, and Matthew chapter 26, verse 15. He would be spit upon and beaten, Isaiah chapter 50 and verse 6, and Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 5. And in death his hands and feet were to be pierced, Psalm 22, verse 16. This is exactly what happened, Matthew chapter 27, verse 30, Luke chapter 24, verse 39. Although he would die and be placed in a rich man's tomb, Isaiah 53 and verse 9. Matthew 27, verse 57. His bones would not be broken. Psalm 34 and verse 20. John 19, verse 33. Nor would his flesh see corruption, because he would be raised from the dead. Psalm 16, verse 10. Acts chapter 2, verse 22 and following. And eventually ascend into heaven. Psalm 110, verse 1 through 3. Psalm 45, verse 6. Acts chapter 1, verse 9 and 10. These prophecies were written hundreds of years before they were fulfilled. But Jesus Christ fulfilled each one of them in every detail. Although the stories of men's lives generally are written after they die, the history of Christ's life was written before he was even born. How? Because God inspired the prophet who wrote the accounts. No book but the Bible contains such prophetic accuracy. Conclusion. Time after time, the Bible has been dead on when it has predicted the future. Secular records document the fact about Tyre, Babylon, and even Jesus Christ. So what does all this prove? It proves one simple thing: that God himself inspired the words written between covers of the Bible. And because that is the case, every human being should welcome the Bible not as the word of men, but as it is, in truth, the word of God. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 13. So the idea of prophecy in the Bible, it's an interesting study. If we just take this last one about the coming of the Messiah, the coming of Christ, and you look up all the prophecies about Christ, and then you look at where they took place in the New Testament, and that they were fulfilled, and trying to figure out how in the world did the writers of the Bible know that these things were going to take place. And some of them took place hundreds of years later. It had to come from God. So to answer the question, is the Bible from God? Yes, I firmly believe that. You got to have faith to believe that God is the one that inspired that. God is the one that had those men write that. So whenever we start looking at the Word of God, whenever we take our Bible and we open our Bible and we look at it, remember that this is the breath of God. This came from God. And if this came from the Creator, came from God, it must be vitally important for my life. So I need to make sure that when I'm reading this, it's not just, oh, I got to read the Bible, or, oh, I got to go to Bible study, or I got to study my Bible. No, but we actually get to read the words of God that He put there for us to understand, so we can know what we need to do in this life. Thank you for joining me for class, and I will see you next time.